Thanks very much, Joe. So clearly I think I had too much of a growth mindset when I had that particular goal of running the 4-minute mile. And so I'd just like to say, Joe, thank you very much. It's a real honor to be here today. It's a real privilege to be able to talk about my current program of research with so many people who are clearly very passionate about teaching and learning. So I'm really looking forward to this discussion. Okay, so I'm going to start with a fairly, I think, non-controversial claim that we can all agree on, and that is that learning is, or that attention rather, is an essential part of learning in the classroom. And indeed, the research backs this up. So for example, prior studies have demonstrated that students who are more attentive in lectures tend to do better on class quizzes and exams and so on. And findings like this really underscore the importance of having what's known as an attention-aware classroom. So in other words, a classroom in which the instructor is aware of various factors that can increase or decrease the attentiveness of their students. And today I'm excited to talk about two such factors that I've currently been researching. One of them is, as Joe said, performance anticipation. And the other is attention contagion, so in other words, the spread of attentive or inattentive behaviors from student to student, quite similar to the phenomenon that Ido is studying. Okay, so first let's talk about performance anticipation. And I love to discuss examples when it comes to this, because I think we can all relate to this phenomenon. So for example, you may have experienced this before. Prior to giving a presentation, you may have found that despite your best efforts, you really struggled to pay attention to the presentation that came immediately before yours. So whether at a conference or at a talk, I feel like I'm kind of making a confession here to the other speakers. Sorry guys, if I ever look distracted, hopefully my research will explain why I did. So this phenomenon I think also can occur for audience members. So you may have experienced this before where you're quite focused on asking a particular question and how you're going to word that question and how you're going to sound. The next thing you know, you've lost track of what the presenter is talking about because you're quite focused on what you're going to say. And then another example that I think everyone can really relate to is this phenomenon of forgetting someone's name immediately after they've introduced themselves to you. And again, this could be because you're focused on your own introduction. So I think what these examples then have in common is that in all cases, you genuinely do want to pay attention and learn from the information that comes before your own presentation. However, your attention is perhaps diverted inward towards self-presentational concerns that you have, and as a result, your learning of information before your presentation can suffer. So I wanted to briefly describe the original study that demonstrated this phenomenon, or at least a simplified version of it. So this was a study by Malcolm Brenner in 1973, and his paradigm looked like that. He had participants sit around a table, and their task was simply to take turns reading words out loud. Did I just cut it? No. Okay, so to take turns reading words out loud, so they would go around the table and they would read words that appeared on a cue card that they turned over, right? So they would take turns. And then afterwards, their goal was to try to remember as many words as they could out of the words that everyone read. And what Brenner found was there was this pre-performance memory deficit, so people had the worst memory, in other words, for the word that came immediately before the word that they had to read. And he called this the next in line effect. Okay, so my collaborators and I, my wonderful collaborators at the University of Waterloo, have become very interested in whether this phenomenon could occur in the classroom. And indeed, we think that there is plenty of reasons why this could occur, and we think this is quite a pertinent issue because students, they do routinely have to give presentations in class. It's quite common from middle school onward, and indeed all throughout grade school and all throughout undergrad, students also have to just participate during class. They're either encouraged to participate or it might even be a graded component, right? So class presentations or participation is common, and unfortunately though, it tends to be quite anxiety provoking. So the majority of people, and indeed the majority of students, as you can see from the study here by Russell and Shaw, what they found was, giving a survey to over 1,000 undergraduate students at a university in England, they found that approximately 2/3 of them reported experiencing moderate to severe fear with respect to giving a talk to a large audience. And you can see the rates of fear for giving even a report to a small group. The majority of undergraduates tended to be at least mildly to moderately fearful. Okay, so sort of herein lies the problem then. I mean, the problem is really that the social anxiety is not just a switch that turns on the moment you start presenting, right? You can have social anxiety or stage fright leading up to a presentation. And you can have self-presentational concerns leading up to a presentation. So perhaps in the classroom, students, especially students who tend to experience public speaking anxiety, they might be experiencing this anxiety leading up to their presentation. So if you can imagine this poor student here, if he has a presentation to give at the end of class, or is thinking about participating at the end of class, he might be drowned in these self-presentational, he might be overwhelmed by self-presentational concerns all the way through the class leading up to his presentation. Right, so my collaborators and I, we wanted to test for this in a controlled, in a laboratory study in which we created a simulated classroom. So similar to the approach that Shanna was advocating earlier, we like to start out in the lab, do a controlled experiment, and then if we find evidence of the existence of the phenomenon, we can then try to test an intervention in the classroom. So in our original, in the study that we're currently running, so we have a pre-registered experiment in which we've collected approximately half the data, and these are from participants at the University of Waterloo, so undergraduates who are participating for course credit. And they're in a simulated classroom in which the task is to give a series of presentations. They take turns giving presentations one at a time. So this is just a look at our simulated classroom. And in each group, there is 5 to 8 undergraduate students. So they're led to the room. They're told, okay, pretend you're in this, you're a student in this class now, and your activity is to take turns giving a 2 to 3 minute presentation on a short research article. And they have 20 minutes to prepare for this presentation. So they're given the article, they're given some blank sheets of paper, and they're told, do your best to prepare, take notes. You can use these notes when you're presenting. And then later you'll be evaluated. All the presentations will be evaluated by the researcher who's playing the role of the teacher in the classroom. Okay, so they get their article. This is just an example of one of the research articles they were given. The quite short articles, obviously in 20 minutes we couldn't give them anything that was very long, but these are only just 2-page research brief reports that we gave them on psychological research. And we asked them to try to cover a series of some, in often cases, quite straightforward points when it came to this research. So in your presentation we said include the author's name, include the year of publication, include the paper it was published in, the main results, and also try to address maybe a strength or a weakness that you noticed in this paper. Okay, so afterwards, after they had the 20 minutes to prepare, they were privately given the position in which they'd be presenting in the class. Right, so they were under the impression that everybody in this class of 5 to 8 students is going to take turns presenting. But in reality, and this is where the deception of the study kind of comes into play here, is that they had been randomly assigned to 3 different conditions, or to one of 3 rather. They've been randomly assigned to one of 3 conditions, and you can see the 3 conditions here. So 1/3 of the class was randomly assigned to, according to the instructions they saw, and they couldn't see each other's instructions, but 1/3 of the class were under the impression that they'd be presenting second. Right? So pretty soon, they would presumably have high performance anticipation. Another 1/3 of the class was under the impression that they would be presenting 5th, so a bit farther down the line, perhaps they wouldn't have as high performance anticipation. And 1/3 of the class, they were really in luck. They were told, well, due to time constraints, you won't actually have to give your presentation. Right? So they wouldn't have any performance anticipation. Okay, and then students were told that after each presentation, there'll be a short quiz that's going to assess how much you learned from each student's presentation. And here's an example. Oh, so then the first student went up to the front of the room, and the first student was, in fact, though, a Confederate that was working as part of the research team, and she had a scripted presentation, right? And the reason why we did the study this way was because we could have this fixed content, this fixed set of information that we could test students' memory on later, and we could examine whether performance anticipation affected their memory for this fixed presentation that was given at the beginning. So we had our sort of spy in the huddle here who was pretending to be a student, and she gave her presentation first. So this is a little snippet of her presentation.
Okay, so hi everyone. The paper I was given to summarize was titled Individual Differences in Media Multitasking and Performance on the NBAC. The paper was written by Brandon Ralph, and it was published in 2017 in a journal called Attention, Perception, and Psychophysics. So the researchers wanted to study a behavior called media multitasking, and media multitasking is basically measuring two forms of media at once.
Okay, so you can see from her presentation, I mean, she's reading clearly, she's reading off notes that she had prepared ahead of time and that was secretly in with her materials, so she could say the exact same thing in every experimental session. And she's seeming a bit unsure of herself, right? And in fact, it was quite convincing. Not a single participant out of the 119 who have been run so far has been suspicious that the first presenter was a Confederate. Not a single one was able to call her out as a Confederate. So that was quite successful. She did an incredible job of acting clearly, as did our other Confederates in the study. So after her first presentation, as I was saying, we wanted to test how much people learned and whether their performance anticipation influenced their learning. Right, so here's an example of just one of the multiple choice questions we had, which covered information from her initial presentation that we gave to the rest of the actual participants in the study. Right, so just to quickly recap, we had our three conditions. We had participants who thought they'd be presenting second, so right after that first presenter, who was the Confederate. We had participants who thought they'd be presenting farther down the line, fifth. And we had participants who thought they weren't going to be presenting at all. And we had two main hypotheses, as you can see here. So we predicted that participants who expected to present just at all, whether second or fifth, would have worse memory for the initial presentation relative to those participants who were told they weren't going to have to present. And then as a more sort of fine-grained hypothesis, we expected that participants who were presenting second, who would presumably have more performance anticipation, would have worse memory than participants who were presenting fifth. Okay, so here are the results. As you can see here, memory was worse for so this is memory performance with regard to that first presentation. Right, so participants were given multiple choice quiz, and you can see here this is chance performance. So it was a 4-item multiple choice quiz on that first presentation. And participants who were presenting, whether they were presenting second or fifth didn't seem to matter, but they both had worse memory of that first presentation relative to participants who weren't presenting at all. Right, so this is a pretty sizable difference here. It's about a grade difference. They did 11% worse when they thought they were going to be presenting relative to those who didn't think they'd be presenting. Okay, so then we had one final measure at the end of the study. So this is before we revealed the deception in the study and mentioned that it was a Confederate. We asked participants to rate on an 11-point Likert scale how anxious they were and also how much they were thinking about their presentation. So these questions were designed to get at whether performance anticipation was in fact leading to more anxiety and more thoughts, or was associated with more anxiety and more thoughts directed towards one's own presentation. And what we found here is that certainly seemed to be the case. So first, in terms of participants' anxiety, they self-reported being more anxious when they were presenting second than when they were presenting fifth. So it's a stepwise function, and then more anxious presenting fifth than not presenting at all. And you can see a similar pattern for the question regarding how often they were thinking about their presentation. So they tended to have more thoughts about their presentation, of course, when they were, not unsurprisingly, when they believed they would be presenting and there was no difference between whether they were presenting second or fifth versus not having to present at all. Of course, there's, in that case, little reason for them to think about their presentation. Okay, and we also wanted to test whether anxiety and whether thoughts about one's performance were associated with memory performance for that first presentation that they saw. And indeed, that was the case. So you can see there's a negative association between anxiety and quiz performance, and also a negative association between thoughts about one's, thoughts about one's presentation and quiz performance as well. So in these scatter plots, so each dot is a participant in the study, you can see the more anxious they were, the worse they tended to do on the quiz regarding the first presentation. And also the more thoughts they had about their presentation, the worse they did on the quiz. Okay, so these, in summary, these preliminary results suggest that performance anticipation harms learning and memory in the classroom. And this effect, so these are just preliminary results so far. We still have to run half our sample and run some more complex statistical analyses. But the results we've seen so far do suggest that this effect might arise because of anxiety and because of thoughts, self-presentational concerns. So I think these results do suggest that there may indeed be quite a sizable issue in classes at grades of all level and also in undergrad, that performance anticipation may interfere with learning prior to one's presentation. Right, so now we're starting to think a little bit, it might be a little bit too early at this stage to implement an intervention, but I'm really curious to hear your guys' thoughts about this. One idea that we have so far is that maybe teachers, if they're attuned to who has particularly high social anxiety or public speaking anxiety in their class, they could encourage that student or those students to go first, right? So they can sort of get their presentation over with and then be able to focus more on other people's presentations or on the rest of the class. Or similarly, teachers could perhaps encourage students with performance anxiety to get their participation sort of over with at the beginning of class if it's a graded component of class, so then they can focus more on the rest of the class. Okay, so I'd like to thank my collaborators on this research project and also NSERC for supporting it. And now I'll move on to the second program of research that I'm involved in right now. And that has to do with attention contagion. So it has to do with the spread of attentive and inattentive behaviors in the classroom. Okay, so what I'll be arguing here is that attentive and inattentive behaviors have this sort of contagious quality in the classroom. They can spread from student to student. And this might sound quite familiar at this point because it is, Ido and I are both, I think, studying the same phenomenon here of shared attention in the classroom. We're taking a somewhat different approach to doing so, of course, and using different measures. So whereas Ido was using neurophysiological measures, as he showed in his presentation, and examining brain synchrony in the classroom, the research of my collaborators and I focused more on behavioral. We use behavioral measures mostly in this research. And we examine the spread of attentive and inattentive behaviors in a simulated classroom. Okay, so I'd like to, before describing our research, I'm just going to outline a brief theoretical account of why we think attentive or inattentive behaviors might spread in the classroom. So if you can see from this student here, looking super attentive, you can see they have several attentive behaviors. They're staring, it would appear, at the lecture. They're leaning forward. They're taking notes, it would appear as well. So let's first consider their eye gaze. Let's first consider the fact that they're focusing mainly at the lecture or the slides. So as Ido mentioned, something relevant here, of course, is research on shared attention. So this research has demonstrated that gaze-following behavior is quite automatic and reflexive in humans, even starting in infancy. And another, this gaze-following behavior that starts in infancy, it's also been found to occur in crowds of people. So for example, in a study by Stanley Milgram and colleagues. This is after his infamous shock experiment. He did something less controversial here. He had a group of Confederates stand on a street corner, and they all looked up at the 6th floor of a building. And then Milgram watched discreetly as pedestrians would walk by these Confederates, and Milgram found that pedestrians would also tend to, with high frequency, look in the same direction as the Confederates did. Right, so this illustrates gaze following in crowds, and also, I mean, it could be in part due to this reflexive tendency to follow eye gaze. But another explanation that I think is relevant here is that people could be appraising the situation that they're in based on the gaze direction of others. So evolutionary psychologists have argued that human beings are particularly adept at inferring the interests and the intentions of others based on their gaze direction. So if you can imagine walking down the street and you're noticing a whole crowd of people looking in one direction, you could infer that, or you'd likely infer that, oh, there must be something particularly important occurring on the 6th floor of that building, or there must be something particularly interesting occurring on the 6th floor of that building. Okay, so now let's consider briefly how these same mechanisms might occur in the classroom. So gaze following behavior might also occur, right? So a student even might tell based on the head direction of someone else where they're looking, and they might follow that, they might imitate that gaze direction. And also gaze direction might influence the appraisal that students have of the lecture. So the student, for example, in the back, noticing this other student who's intently staring at the lecture, might infer that, oh, this must be a really interesting and important lecture, or else why else would that person be, staring at it so fixedly? So let's now briefly consider just a few other attentive behaviors, such as frequent note-taking or leaning forward. Sorry, I'm being directed back here, so you'll have to do some gaze following, I guess. So in the case of these other behaviors, also very similarly, human beings tend to naturally mimic each other's behavior. This is what's known as the chameleon effect. You may have heard of it. It's quite non-conscious behavior. So this might also occur in the context of the classroom as well. So basically the same two mechanisms might occur. Individuals might non-consciously mimic the attentive behaviors of others in the class, or they might appraise how interesting or how important the lecture is based on the attentive behaviors of others. So they see someone leaning forward, taking a lot of notes. They infer, based on those behaviors, this must be an important lecture. This must be a valuable lecture. Okay, and in the case of inattentive behaviors, the same two mechanisms I think would apply here. So there might be mimicry of inattentive behaviors, such as slouching or looking away from the lecture. And also, inattentive behaviors may signal that a lecture has low value, right? And that might lead classmates to invest fewer attentional resources. So you can imagine a student, you can imagine a student who notices another student not paying attention. That student might infer that, oh, well, maybe I can just get away with only reading the textbook from this class and I'll do well because these other students are paying attention. Or they might think, well, maybe this particular part of the lecture just isn't very interesting. So it might make them less likely to pay attention to it. Okay, so now I want to get into the research that many talented collaborators and I at the University of Waterloo have done on attention contagion. And this is the basic setup we had. So this was a lab experiment that we wanted to tightly control this experiment and test for the existence of attention contagion. So this was our setup. So we had the participant and a Confederate, another Confederate in this study, led to a lab room in which we had a classroom set up, right? So this participant was with someone else who they thought was a participant, but who really wasn't. The Confederate always sat in front of them and to the side, so in their line of sight as they were watching a lecture. So this is just a brief clip of the lecture here. It was on a Yale lecture on the history of Roman architecture, so something they wouldn't have pre-existing knowledge of.
This is the amphitheater as
Okay, and there's a hidden camera in the corner there as well that was recording the Confederate and the participant throughout the study. And so what we were hypothesizing here, you might have guessed now, is what we manipulated rather was the attentiveness of the Confederate, because what we were hypothesizing was that the attentiveness of the Confederate would influence the attentiveness and the learning of the participant who is in the room with that Confederate. Right? So we randomly assigned participants to one of two conditions. Either they were in the room with an attentive Confederate. This is what some of the attentive behaviors looked like. So you can see she's taking a lot of notes, nodding along, yeah, agree with that point, and even a quite interested expression at the end there. So the inattentive condition, in contrast, is a much different story. You'll notice we have the same Confederate here, controlled and both across both conditions, and she's just looking in this condition like she's completely over it, just totally checked out. We have a bit of a yawn there. She's fidgeting, you might be able to notice, with the little dangle strings or whatever they are on her sweatshirt. And it looks like she's kind of breaking the fourth wall there a little bit at the end. But in fact, as I briefly alluded to, the hidden camera was inside a clock. So that was another inattentive behavior, was to periodically glance over at the clock, right? Which also conveys that more important things to be doing right now than watching this lecture. Okay, so importantly, we did keep out the influence of distraction. This was a technology-free zone in this classroom, based on the fact that previous research by Forrin and others have demonstrated that technology in the classroom can be quite distracting, and we wanted to rule out the influence of technological distraction in our study of attention contagion. Okay, so I'd like to briefly then acknowledge just how incredibly brave this group of research assistants were, because they had to keep on watching this video over and over again in the study. So this reaction here was quite authentic in the inattentive condition. In the attentive condition, they had to really give the acting performance of their life by the end of the study. Okay, so I want to briefly cover now the measures we had. You've seen one of them. It was note-taking. We wanted to observe whether the behavior of note-taking could spread from the Confederate to the participant. Another measure we had was behavioral coding. So as I said, there was the camera that recorded them in the corner of the room, and then we had a group of research assistant coders who watched videos of just the participant. So they were blind to the condition of the study. They only saw the participant, and they just coded, and they're blind to the hypothesis as well, of course, and they just coded the behavior, the attentiveness of the participant at 4 different time points. So for each quarter, for a section of each quarter of the lecture, they rated the participant's attentiveness, and they also rated how fidgety the participant was, because we're also curious if that fidgeting behavior that we saw earlier would be contagious, and also how sleepy the participant was, because our Confederates were acting more sleepy in the inattentive condition than the attentive condition, so we wanted to see if that would be contagious. Okay, and we also had 16 what's known as thought probes, which were mentioned earlier in an earlier talk, interspersed throughout the lecture. So periodically the lecture would stop and participants were asked whether they were on task, so whether they were paying attention to the lecture, or whether they were mind wandering, and the third option was whether they were paying attention to something else in the room. We wanted to use that as a measure of whether they were more distracted by the inattentive Confederate than the attentive Confederate. Okay, and we also had at the very end a comprehension measure. So we gave participants a 16-item multiple choice test at the end to assess whether, or to test the hypothesis that they would have better memory of the lecture. They would have learned more if they were with the attentive Confederate than the inattentive Confederate. Okay, so the final thing we had was a manipulation check. We just wanted to see whether participants, whether they rated those who were with the attentive Confederate, rated that person as being more attentive than the inattentive Confederate, than in the inattentive Confederate condition, right? Because that was quite essential. And indeed, this was the case. So this is really just showing that the Confederates were extremely effective in their acting, right? This is a massive effect. So They did an incredible job. Cheers to them for that, for their heroic efforts in the study. Okay, so then note-taking. So let's talk about that first. You can see that note-taking behavior was influenced by whether there was an attentive or an inattentive Confederate in the room with them. Those with the attentive Confederate took about 50% more notes than those who were with an inattentive Confederate. Then we had our video coding measure. So we had the RAs who coded how attentive the participant appeared to be at various points of the lecture. And we find two main effects here. So first, we find this overall difference of those who are with the attentive Confederate behaving more attentively than those who are with the inattentive Confederate, right, consistently throughout the duration of the lecture. And we see a main effect of time as well. So behaviors became progressively less attentive in both conditions over the course of the lecture. And then for fidgeting, we see an identical pattern of results here in terms of there being a main effective condition. So those who are with the inattentive Confederate fidgeted more than those who are with the attentive Confederate. And also there was a main effective time. So fidgeting behavior increased over the duration of the lecture in both conditions. And finally, in terms of sleepiness, they look like the fidgeting results. So basically, we have sleepiness increasing in both conditions over the course of the lecture. And we also see that those who are with the inattentive Confederate, they were rated as being more sleepy during the lecture than those who are with the attentive Confederate. Right? So even some of the sleepiness behaviors seem to be contagious, and we even found that some participants did actually fall asleep for the duration of the lecture, and that almost always happened when they were with the inattentive Confederate. They would fall asleep, some for 20, 25 minutes. So something to keep in mind when participants don't think they're being watched in a psych study, they might be there sleeping during the course of the study. Okay, so these are the self-report ratings. This is a thought probe rating of whether participants indicated they were attentive or mind-wandering or watching the sights and sounds during the lab. And they were significantly more, or for a significantly higher proportion of probes, they indicated they were on task when they were with the attentive Confederate versus the inattentive Confederate. And then for these sort of off-task options, so either mind-wandering or attending to the sights and the sounds in the room. But they're both, I'll just describe it, they're both non-significant effects, which is encouraging in the case of our sights and sounds measure, because we were a bit, because it kind of rules out the possibility that there was more distraction in the inattentive condition than the attentive condition. So it doesn't seem like distraction was the factor that was driving our results. Okay, so this briefly, I'd like to show you just how attentiveness changed over the course of the lecture in terms of the self-reported on-task ratings. And you can see a U-shaped function here. So participants were the least attentive, at least according to their self-reports, at the middle of the lecture. And then it would seem like they were able to perhaps muster some attentional resources when they knew the lecture was about to be over. Perhaps some of you are familiar with this in your own classes. I'd be curious to talk to you about it afterwards. And you can also see that at the beginning of the study, so when they're first with the Confederate, there's no difference in their self-reported attentiveness, but this difference does emerge gradually over the course of the study, right? So the Confederate seems to have their influence take hold as contagion seems to take place as the study progresses, as the lecture progresses, right? Okay, and finally and importantly, the comprehension measure. So again, you see chance at 25% on a 4-option multiple choice test. And participants who are with the attentive other in the room, the attentive Confederate, did do significantly better on the multiple choice test on the lecture compared to those who are with the inattentive Confederate, about a 6% difference in performance. Okay, so in summary, inattentiveness and attentiveness we find in our simulated classroom study did spread from student to student, or from Confederate to student in this case. And our next step then is to test whether this will happen in a live classroom. And on top of that, we're also curious about these mechanisms that I discussed earlier. Is this effect driven by mimicry? Is it driven by an appraisal of the situation that students make based on each other's attentive or inattentive behaviors? Likely both things, so we're interested in testing those two explanations. One other related study that we've done to this point was one in which we looked at whether the attentiveness of students who appear in a lecture video, so the students who are on the side there, you might recognize Alyssa from her talk earlier, she's a collaborator in this project. She was acting in this study along with the other Confederates here, and they were either acting attentively or inattentively. Carry forward a lot from the Greeks. And when the Romans emerge on the scene, they're really... Okay, so I'm just delivering this history lecture, which I'm reading off teleprompters, trying to pretend like I'm teaching a history lecture that we're then showing to participants in the study. This was an online study, I should have mentioned, so participants are just viewing this lecture video online, and they're told to try to pay attention, and there'll be a test at the end. So we were wanting to test whether the attentiveness of the audience members or the class, the attentiveness of the class in the lecture influenced the attentiveness of the student, of the participant who's watching this lecture video subsequently. So in this condition, of course, the same presentation, but the behaviors are quite different. So you can see really inattentive behaviors from the students here versus quite attentive behaviors there. So does it make a difference when you're watching a lecture video? Does the attentiveness of students you see in the video, of the audience you see in the video, does it affect your own attentiveness? And it would not appear to be the case for the students, at least for the students that we had in this study, who again were University of Waterloo undergraduates who were watching this lecture video online. So we found that it didn't matter what video they watched, whether there was an attentive class or an inattentive class, the attentiveness of the participant watching was clearly not influenced or not significantly influenced. And we also tested their memory for the lecture, and again we see no influence of the attentiveness of the audience members on the learning of the people watching the video. So clearly there's no effect in viewing people online. There's no contagion sort of through the monitor affecting the people watching in this case. This could be because mimicry, you wouldn't expect mimicry to occur with people you're just seeing in a video. Mimicry is argued to be mediated by affiliation goals, and you feel like you'll never be meeting these people in the video, so you have no tendency to mimic their behavior then perhaps. And also appraising their behaviors might be sort of less relevant in this case because you're in a different situation. Like you're watching the video, those people are in the actual class, so perhaps less value to appraising their behavior. Okay, and a final study that I'd like to briefly mention is one we have in the pipeline, Joe and Faria and I, and some other collaborators here at McMaster, and what we're planning to, an intervention of sorts that we're planning to test in the fall in a Psych 100 class, in an intro psych class at McMaster, is to see whether the attentive behaviors of teaching assistants in the class can spread throughout the class and perhaps influence some of those first-year students in the class. So our plan is something like this. We're going to have the roughly 30 McMaster TAs spread out through the classroom. They're going to have a bright red McMaster TA shirt on, so they're easily identifiable by the first-year students. And we're going to have 3 different conditions. Either they're going to be acting really attentively, so taking copious notes, being really good role models for the other students, or they're just going to be kind of neutral. They're going to be watching the lecture but not really displaying very many attentive behaviors, or we're going to have a case in which no TAs are in the classroom, right? And our hypothesis is we're expecting, based on our attention contagion account, that students, intro psych students in the class will be the most attentive and will perform the best in the class on quizzes and exams when they're surrounded by these attentive TAs in particular. Okay, so I'd just like to close by saying that the research program that I'm involved in now, that I'm eager to talk to you about, is really trying to move the ball towards an attention-aware classroom. And what we see in this research, in this last study, or in this last project, is that in terms of attentiveness, like no student is an island in the classroom, right? Attention is this dynamic thing that can ebb and flow and spread from student to student in the classroom. And it'll take the efforts of both researchers and teachers to discover effective interventions for fostering the spread of attentiveness and perhaps also for stifling the flow of inattentiveness in the classroom. So thank you very much for your attention. Thank you to my collaborators and the amazing research assistants. Thank you very much. Thank you, Jeff.
Okay, so we have time for a few questions before we take a quick break. I might start off with a question. So what I really like is how you're taking theory, you're designing a priori predictions and testing things out in the lab. And then the next step, of course, is testing out an intervention in the classroom.
Yeah.
So a question I have, not just for you, but for all researchers, is that you'll be exposing students to an attention behavior condition, and some students to a neutral condition. Are there any ethical concerns that you might consider there?
So in terms of, for example, the intervention we have in mind for the intro psych class, yeah, I think, and even more broadly speaking, there definitely would be some ethical considerations here. Like, for example, in the intro psych class, we wouldn't want to have the TAs act really inattentively, right? So if we have, if we're having confidence in the effect we're studying and we believe that inattention is contagious, we wouldn't want to find that effect in a live classroom where it could actually harm the learning of intro psych students, for example. So there certainly are, I think, some ethical considerations, which is a good reason why we test things in the lab in a simulated classroom before moving to a real classroom.
How about some students having maybe the advantage of having pro-social behaviors modeled for them?
So yeah, I mean, could you give me an example, like maybe having like older siblings that they're used to?
Or within like the experiment.
Oh, within the experiment.
Yeah, like one group of students being exposed to really attentive TAs and another group being exposed to neutral TAs.
Oh, okay, right. So in that case, I think there's the value of counterbalancing the study, right? So we're planning to have each section, there's 3 different sections of the class, and each section of the class is going to be exposed to each of the 3 conditions, so either attentive TAs, neutral TAs, or no TAs. So they're each going to be exposed to that, so sort of on equal footing, and hopefully we do find this benefit of having the attentive TAs there, and hopefully we also don't really find evidence of a cost of having just neutral TAs there. Thanks, Joe.
Thanks for a really interesting talk.
Thank you.
I have another question about individual differences. So within each group, assumedly, there's the students who suffer greatly by having an inattentive student in the room, and a student who is kind of impervious to their surroundings and will learn no matter what. Do you have any ideas about what those differences are and how we might capitalize on them as instructors to kind of build the intensive conscious classroom environment?
Right, that's a really great question. So I think that there could indeed be some individual differences where some students are just so intrinsically motivated that they sort of might have their blinders on in effect, and they might just be really focused regardless of what other students in the class are doing. They're just so intrinsically motivated that they're going to be attentive really no matter what. I think that would be an interesting perhaps thing to examine, what you're suggesting. Related to that, I mean, I think it's really a matter of what goals are active that the student has. I mean, students have so many goals that can be active at a given time. They just have so much demands on their time. So they could have an achievement goal that as an instructor we'd want to keep active for that course, but they could have these other goals of strengthening social ties or even of just paying the rent or whatever, and whatever their goal is currently active is probably going to direct their attention, right? So I think an important goal of an instructor is to make sure that the achievement goal is continually active for a student. And for some students, based on individual differences, they just might be particularly motivated and they might always have that achievement goal active, so it might not matter so much these other situational factors like what other students are doing in the class. For other students, it might be right, they might have pretty high activation for other goals, and because of that, it might be more of a concerted effort is needed by the instructor to reinforce the value of the class, to continually reinforce why this class should be valuable to this particular student, and in that way that goal could be continually active, and for those students they might also be more affected by the behaviors of other students in the classroom. It's just something I'm postulating. Thank you for the question.
So just building on that line of reasoning, but taking it back to the first line of research, so the pre-performance and attention. So the study that you did, it seems like, I'm just missing something there, it was relatively low stakes, right? They're having to present. What's the reason are they given for having to present, just for the sake of the experiment, or? Right.
So yes, it was just like within the context of the experiment, and we were curious at first really how high the stakes would be and whether this would be a strong enough manipulation to evoke social anxiety and performance anxiety. And what we do find is, I mean, we could see from their anxiety ratings that it's not crippling anxiety, and we're glad that we're not evoking crippling anxiety in students, of course. But there is, marked anxiety there. At least there's more anxiety for when they believe they would have to present versus not having to present. So in this context, I think it would be just some of the evaluative pressure from peers. Like, I guess no one wants to, look dumb in front of their peers, right? So people want to, appear as confident as they can in front of the researcher, in front of their peers. And I think that evaluative sort of pressure was enough to induce some performance anxiety in the study.
Yeah, so I guess that made me wonder, how do you conceptualize these self-presentational concerns as being kind of distinct from the kind of achievement concerns, or can one magnify the other? So would you expect in a high-stakes situation that they would kind of merge together to form a really strong kind of anxiety that would be even more kind of crippling in terms of attentiveness?
Right. I mean, for an actual class, and especially for someone with high achievement motivation or high achievement goals, they would certainly, I think, experience a stronger effect. So I think short of using an actual classroom, short of running an actual classroom study, this is perhaps the highest we could induce anxiety in the context of a simulated lab experiment, but certainly the stakes I think would be higher for in a classroom or giving a conference presentation, for example.
But you think that would magnify the effects that you've found?
And I think, oh yes, and I certainly do think it would magnify the effects. It would diminish learning. I think the higher, and we sort of saw this from the correlations that were presented of more thoughts about one's presentation was associated with poorer learning of the prior presentation. So yeah, the more anxiety, the higher the stakes, probably the worse learning would be for that pre-performance information. Yeah, thank you for the questions, David.
A kind of a comical question about social contagion. Mm-hmm. What kind of analog would you predict with small children? For example, I tried to teach in my kindergartner's classroom about the brain, and I nearly passed out at the end of it. It was just so much stimulation for me. And what I can imagine is that the off-track adult student is really still on task when you compare what off-task looks like among a 5-year-old. So I guess I'd like to hear your thoughts, and then maybe how you could apply it to real behavioral issues in the classroom and what social contagion might look like in that regard.
Wow, that's a great question. I mean, it's outside of my area of expertise, so I sort of hesitate to speculate here a bit because I've never done any research with young children before. And I agree with your intuition, though, that certainly children can be more, just based on experience, I'm not familiar with the research, but more susceptible to, let's say, their surroundings or to social factors perhaps than adults would be. I mean, this could be linked to sort of what David mentioned, that there aren't really these high stakes, I think, for children in grade school of like, you really must do well, so I'm not going to allow the other people around me to influence me. It's more about, social goals are more highly are more highly active and encouraged I guess, with younger children. So I certainly agree with your intuition there. And yeah, let's talk afterwards when I've had some more time to think, and you can tell me what you think. Yeah.
I just have a question about what the rationale was for choosing TAs to have them in the classroom. I know when I was in my undergrad, TAs weren't really my peers. They were very much like an authority figure, and I wonder how that also would affect the attention of the students.
Yeah, I think you're spot on with that observation that could be a reasonable alternate explanation for the effect that we're predicting here of the attentiveness of the TAs to spread to students in the class, that it could just be that they're an authority figure, that they're a role model. So it could be quite conscious social learning that's occurring of the students sort of learning the behaviors and sort of the classic Bandura, like Bobo doll, like watching the behaviors of an authority figure and sort of learning what good acceptable behaviors are from these successful TAs in the class. So that could be a factor, and what we've tried to sort of account for that in our design in terms of having a neutral condition where the TAs are there, so they're still authority figures that are there, but they're not engaged in the same attentive behaviors. So hopefully in a sense that will control for the presence of these role models in the class while manipulating their behavior. Although in either case it could be, I suppose, this sort of role modeling that's occurring when the right, that might be interacting with the effect. What you're suggesting may indeed be the case. I think it's something we have to think about more, whether there'll be this role modeling, more conscious role modeling effect that might occur in this experiment. So thank you very much for raising that.
Maybe one last question. An alternate strategy that I've heard of when students have to make presentations is to just draw names from a hat. So one person gives a presentation and no one knows who's the next person, and you just draw the name from a hat. And there's also the practice of cold calling students in the classroom. I wonder, based on your research, what are your thoughts on both of these practices?
Right, so I love the idea of drawing names from a hat and cold calling. And that's found to be effective in terms of, I believe there's some prior research that we learned about last year showing the benefits of cold calling. Now from a sort of performance anticipation perspective though, it's possible that socially anxious students might be really intimidated by this prospect of being cold called. So they might think at any time during the class they could be called upon. And that could lead to a sustained level of performance anxiety that might occur throughout the entire class. So that's a potential downside, perhaps, of cold calling. Picking names from a hat, yeah, maybe that would be effective. However, I mean, I think the people who got the number of presenting first, they'd certainly be in luck.
What I mean is that one person goes and then you haven't even drawn the next name yet, so the entire class is waiting in anticipation. I see. So perhaps that anticipation might be detrimental as well, I suppose. It could be equally to everybody, right? In both cases, cold calling and name drawing, it could be occurring to everybody then, I agree, yeah. All right, thank you very much.
Thank you, Joe. Thanks, everyone.